Okay, good morning and welcome everybody to the forum Class Struggle on the Waterfront, Lessons from the ILWU. This forum is hosted by the Bolshevik Tendency. My name is Christoph. I have the pleasure of chairing this meeting. And I'll just say a few words as a way of introduction before I hand over to Jason for his presentation. And then after his presentation, we will move into open discussion where everybody can speak. So this year on February 16th, a very important action, in my humble opinion at least, took place in San Francisco as well as around the world. And this was the International Day of Action for Mumia Abu-Jamal. Mumia is an ex-Black Panther and award-winning journalist who has spent the last 40 years in prison. He is innocent of the crime he was convicted for. The crime was a murder of a cop in Philadelphia. And the ILWU was part of an International Day of Action on February 16th. In the ports of San Francisco and Oakland, the longshoremen shut down the ports for the entire day. They did this with the slogan, "Free Mumia Abu-Jamal." Comrades from the Bolshevik Tendency participated in the march in San Francisco on that day, which was led from the ILWU Local 10 in San Francisco down to the ferry terminal. And I'll tell you what the banner said that we marched behind. This was the ILWU banner from Local 10. "Free Mumia Abu-Jamal, he is innocent and framed. D.A. Krasner, Judge Clemens, drop the charges now. Unions fight for Mumia's freedom." The ILWU has also sent delegates around the world and in the lead up to this action to South Africa in particular, where they met the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, and they obtained the support from this very important labor organization in South Africa. So they also are struggling from South Africa for the release of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And NUMSA is a very radical, militant trade union, and of course it shows that international labor solidarity is not just something we read about in books. It's a real thing, and it still happens. So what is remarkable, in my opinion, about this day is that it was a strike by longshoremen with an explicitly political objective. They are also involved in a current labor dispute with their employer, but they went on strike and they linked their struggle directly with the freedom of Mumia Abu-Jamal. That is something that does not happen very often. You don't often have workers go on strike for explicitly political objectives. But this shows what can be done and how powerful the unions are. So this, of course, is part of a long tradition of the ILWU, and in particular Local 10 in San Francisco, where in the past we had involvement, and we have some things that Jason, I think, will talk about in terms of our involvement there in the union and the work that we did there. And with that said, I'll hand over to Jason, who will introduce some of the lessons, at least, from the ILWU for the next 30 minutes, and then we'll have open discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Fair disclosure that I'm not a member of the ILWU, but we have had people who were in the ILWU who are a part of our organization, and we have a sort of continuity with some of the caucus work that was done in the ILWU, including Howard Keeler, who was one of the veteran longshore workers, who's now in his 90s, so has been retired for quite some time. But some of what I'm presenting draws on some of my experiences in interviewing Howard, talking to Howard, working with him over the years. I want to start just with some context. So there's been a lot of media coverage this month focused on the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. 20 years. I had just turned 18 when the US bombed Iraq in 1991, and it transformed me into a committed anti-imperialist. I was 30 when W went back with the neocon cabal, with the implicit support of a majority of the Democratic Party, used 9/11 as a pretext to finish what he felt dead he couldn't do. And I'm 50 today, so that's a whole adult lifetime of observing the country I live in use its military and economic might to reduce a country halfway around the world to rubble in order to control the oil spigots and position itself as the dominant empire in the imperialist New World Order. One thing that hasn't gotten much coverage in all of this anniversary coverage is the fact that Iraq also provoked the first successful political strike ever conducted by American workers living within the belly of the beast against military aggression. That was on May Day 2008, when 25,000 dockers of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILWU, shut down every port on the West Coast, all the way from San Diego to Seattle, to protest the occupation of Iraq. It was billed as a no peace, no work holiday, and it succeeded in defiance of shipping bosses and labor arbitrators who denounced it as an illegal strike and went to the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, threatening to invoke Taft-Hartley. The union bureaucracy, which was reluctantly drawn into the action and had done their utmost to limit the demonstration, including reducing the strike call from 24 hours to 8, understood that if they caved, they would undermine their own future bargaining power. So the dockers stood firm, and even though it was touch and go, every port was shut down. It had sent a powerful message of international solidarity to all those suffering under the jackboot of US imperialism. The defiance of Taft-Hartley, though, was nearly as important as the political nature of the strike. To the best of my knowledge, it was the first time since the 1978 miners' strike where workers defied the government and bosses and stayed out. I imagine nobody in this room is too shocked that we aren't getting anniversary reminders about that action. Back in 2008, it was big news on the left coast, but around here it was virtually ignored. More surprisingly, most ostensibly socialist organizations downplayed it too. That in spite of the fact that it was a striking confirmation of the organized power of the working class, a concrete manifestation that workers in key sectors can act as agents of social transformation. In some cases, there were clearly sectarian refusals to acknowledge the political traditions associated with the opposition leadership inside the ILWU locals, particularly in the Bay Area. But it also converges with the growing abandonment over the last 50 plus years of seeing the working class, the proletarian in the classic Marxist terminology, as the only class able to bring about the successful socialist transformation of society. Indeed, there was at that time, just as there is today, much chasing after other social forces that have poured out into the streets to oppose capitalism, from anti-globalization movement to the Arab Spring to Occupy, all of which express a certain level of perfectly understandable outrage. I don't want to dismiss such demonstrations, many of which are perfectly supportable and some of which I've participated in along with my comrades. I do want to contrast, though, that with the social power of the organized working class, inherent in their relationship to the means of production. And of course, it isn't just production, but also key aspects of the distribution network, which was powerfully demonstrated by the ILWU in 2008, and in which we see a bit of the latent potential of today in things like the Amazon organizing drives, right? And COVID, I think, really brought that home to some people in a way that maybe it had not been transparent or obvious before. The degree to which the pursuit of profitability continually globalizes manufacturing and also incentivizes the capitalists to focus on maximizing short-term profits with just-in-time distribution networks, et cetera. I think many people got a wake-up call as to what happens when those supply chains get disrupted and how key labor is in making products flow. There was all of that coverage of cargo ships sitting off the coast. It came home in the healthcare terms with the shortages of the PPE. It came home for a lot of us in families in more domestic ways. I have a daughter who's now 6, and I can remember looking at the online shipping information constantly a couple of Christmases ago, and thinking, oh, this is sitting on a container someplace, So I'm sure a few of you were there with me in that. So there was this palpable frustration, right, about the way things were breaking down under COVID that showed that this is really the power of labor that moves things, that produces, that capitalism does a very good job of obscuring, of not making transparent with false ideology. That's not denigrating, of course, longshore workers or production workers or anything in any way, since they were certainly performing a vital function under the greatest difficulty, right? But to point out that you can see the manifestation of the true power of workers within the system in those fragile moments. Now, 2008 was not the first time by any means that the ILWU took labor action for political purposes. In 1974, in opposition to the bloody Pinochet junta, the ILWU boycotted cargo from Chile. Somewhat more well-known, in 1984, members of the ILWU initiated a political strike which boycotted the South African cargo on the Ned Lloyd Kimberley in San Francisco. Nelson Mandela himself attributed the 11-day anti-apartheid boycott as being the spark that reignited the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. At that time, in 1984, a South African trade unionist also acknowledged as much, sending a letter to the ILWU strike leaders that read in part, "I am deeply impressed by your compassion, solidarity, love for the underdog, the oppressed, exploited masses of our land. Your contribution, dedication, and determination for social change is indeed a morale booster for me and the millions of our brothers and sisters who continue to face the armed might of the South African government through the barrel of the gun." The most immediate predecessor to the 2008 anti-war strike was a similar one-day action in 1999 in solidarity with the imprisoned former Black Panther, Mumia Abu-Jamal. On April 24th, 1999, which was Mumia's birthday, and as one of his appellate court dates was looming, all the ports on the West Coast shut down for one busy Saturday, and something that people don't know anything about the culture of longshore on the West Coast. Saturday is actually the busiest work day, so it's not that it's a day off they're shutting down. It was actually a prime day that did affect the shipping magnates. Anyways, it was a strike, as was the recent day of action demanding Mumia's freedom. That also happened to be the first time in ILWU history that a tactic was used of calling a stop work meeting, which was something that was contractually allowable, defensible, to cover the action. So the way that the work stoppage was quasi-legal was under the auspices of the contract stop work meeting conditions. This was the strategy that they repeated in 2008, and because it had been successful in 1999, they thought that it would be very strategically effective, but in fact, the bosses resisted, and that was when the NLRB was dragged in, and the threat of invoking Taft-Hartley. But it also ended up by backing, as I said, the union tops into defending the action, because they understood that the erosion of their power that it would represent if they caved and gave up that contractual right to call the stop work meeting at the time of their choosing would significantly weaken the union. So that's why it is. So why is it that we see these manifestations, workers taking political action on the waterfront in San Francisco, and we see that level of militancy almost nowhere else in the U.S. unions today? Is it just the way it is? Something in the air in California? The strange vibration of a whole generation with a new explanation? And I guess the sort of crunchy bohemianism of California culture doesn't hurt, in that it means the dockers get a certain level of community support, which has played a key role in some of these struggles. But these men and women are not wearing flowers in their hair under the white caps, right? Is it because of their majority-minority union? As early as the 1970s, the ILWU was 70% African American. Today, a majority of the workers in the union are either Latino or Black. Sure, that plays a part in it, right? Because of white supremacy embedded in American capitalism and the way race has been used to divide workers and segregate Black workers in particular in the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs, Black workers certainly have a history of militant struggle. In both Oakland and San Francisco, the call for Mumia's freedom certainly had a strong resonance amongst the majority black workforce. When the black dock workers in Charleston, South Carolina were faced with a scab stevedoring company and dockers were arrested, the ILWU played a critical role in the defense campaign of the Charleston Five, sending members of the ILWU's Longshore Caucus to Charleston and on a campaign up and down the West Coast to orchestrate solidarity and assisting with their international contacts to arrange for sympathetic strike actions in Spain with the refusal to unload the scab ships. Still, there are a lot of other majority black unions, and most of them today don't have the level of militancy that's anywhere near comparable to what we see in the ILWU. A part of the militancy of black workers, of course, stems from the way racism forces them into that strategic position as it long barred them from other types of jobs. So is the militancy related to the nature of the manual labor in the port? I mean, there was a conception for a long time this is very unskilled, back-breaking labor, but I think lots of longshore workers would dispute that, in fact, that there's actually a certain skill involved in knowing how to handle these cargoes, handle the equipment, without killing yourself, really, and without wrecking the cargo that you're unloading. But of course, you know, there is a part of it to which the idea that the conditions, the environment of your work determine your consciousness, right? And this is one of the key insights of the manifesto that Mark codifies, that in the development of modern industry, therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeois produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. I think that's as true as it was 170 years ago, right? It's also, of course, a form of work, working on the docks, that inherently involves a certain socialization, teamwork. There's an interesting book by a former longshore worker, Reg Thoreau, that has a great title, came out in about 1995, How to Tell When You're Tired. And he's describing the 1970s, 1980s workforce that he was a part of. But he says, you know, quite often it was very hard work, but you set your own pace. And since all longshoremen worked together in gangs, you had someone to talk to while you heaved the cargo around. In between loads, while waiting for the hook, you might even have a can of beer, especially if they were loading it somewhere on the ships. In those days, the holdmen and gang dockmen numbered 14, and there were 5 to 8 gangs to a ship. If you counted the gang bosses, the forklift drivers, the winch drivers, carmen, and clerks, there'd be close to 150 men working on a pier at a time. An average gang would turn out 150 to 200 tons each shift. The stevedore companies always liked that higher figure, but they were careful not to push too hard because if they did, they knew they might end up with the lower. So, this sort of workplace where workers are concentrated together and interact as a team certainly assists in organizing, right? There have been numerous attempts over the years to organize all sorts of occupations in the US, from taxi drivers to barbers to prostitutes. Nothing wrong with attempting organizing unorganized workers, right? Very positive with the developments we see at Amazon, Starbucks. But these sort of occupations are very difficult to unionize and very difficult to maintain a union, the ones I was citing earlier, because of the atomized nature of the work. In conditions, a mindset where all too often folks in those sorts of occupations see themselves as competing against each other, even when they do interact. So you can have these moments of, say, a very militant taxi strike, or you can have a barbershop organizing that, say, piggybacks on the massive auto organizing in Detroit during the height of the Revolutionary Union movement in the 70s, but it's hard to maintain. One of the negative virtues of longshore work is that most sane people don't develop a fantasy about owning the crane or the boats or the warehouse. So they fit Marx's model pretty well in the sense that you have no interest outside of the overthrow of capitalism. But here we are 170 years after the manifesto, and dockers aren't rising up around the world to overthrow capitalism, even though we can point to a particularly high level of class consciousness and militancy in that occupation. And because this isn't just the US, you can see other examples from all over the world. one of the most inspiring longshore struggles I can point to was something that was called the February Strike in the German-occupied Netherlands in 1941, which was the first and only large-scale strike in all of Europe that was directed against the deportation of the Jews. The strike was drowned in blood after 3 days. Now, interestingly, that strike was organized by the outlawed Communist Party of the Netherlands. Not coincidentally, the longshore workers in San Francisco first won union recognition in a bloody 1934 strike that was also led by communists. That strike began on May 9th, 1934, when longshoremen in every West Coast port walked out, and it peaked on Bloody Thursday with the death of 2 of the workers, but it led to the successful unionization of ports up and down the coast. There's a red thread in that sense that runs through the history of the ILWU. Harry Bridges, who was an Australian Stalinist, emerged as one of the preeminent leaders of longshore. He ended up by being a bureaucrat, and I think people should have opposed him, and I think his politics played a role in that corruption. But on the other hand, the ILWU resisted the McCarthyite purges because of that history and because of that leadership. And there's still a memorial outside the Union Hiring Hall to those workers who died that day. And when that's what the bureaucracy is based on, there isn't the same degree of an impulse to whitewash it and remove the class struggle from the history. And I think that was a key element of the ILWU culture, is that people remembered that 1934 strike, and they remembered the role that ostensibly Marxist workers played in the leadership of that strike. Coming out of the depths of the Depression, and 1934 we can see as a bit of a turning point in class struggle in the Depression, Chris Kinder, who was a longtime longshore worker and was a member of the Spartacus League, group we consider to have once been revolutionary and trace our heritage to, wrote a series of articles in the 1970s, which I'm going to draw from kind of liberally. But he pointed to that 1934 strike wave, and he said, in that entire period, there were only 3 real victories, all led by revolutionists or professed revolutionists. Stalinists led the San Francisco Waterfront strike. The musty-eyed American Workers' Party, later to fuse with the Trotskyists, led the Toledo Auto Light strike. And Trotskyists led the Minneapolis truck drivers' strikes. These strikes were successful because they established powerful new unions along the industrial lines, which spread throughout whole industries and regions. The organization of the bulk of the proletariat under revolutionary leadership, finally displacing the reactionary AFL leadership, clearly loomed. To head off this threat, a section of the AFL leaders later formed the CIO. So what I really want to emphasize in this talk, and if you take nothing else away from it, is the point of view that the political dimension is key. One of Lenin's contributions that I think deepens Marxist theory and eventually brings him to the idea of the vanguard party, which he begins to develop really in What Is to Be Done, is his recognition that the conditions of work alone, the experience of exploitation, can lead to a bread and butter trade union consciousness, right? There's a militancy to resist exploitation. That's natural, that's inevitable, that's produced by the system, that's what Marx was identifying. But that's not socialist theory. The program, the link, the bridge between the day-to-day experiences of exploitation, the humiliation, the drudgery, the alienation from one's own labor, to something beyond the mere will to resist, which is not to resist that, because we could use more will to resist, and will to resist is a good thing, but that program is critical. That's something that has to come from without, too. It doesn't just organically emerge from the shop floor. That's not to say that it doesn't come from within the working class, because there are plenty of autodidact worker intellectuals, and just as there are plenty of members of the middle class or other classes who identify with the working class as being the agent of social change and cross the class line to side and to identify with the working class as the class that has the ability to liberate humanity. the more advanced workers need to become conscious of themselves, really, as a single class whose actions are uncompromisingly counterposed to the entire class of capitalists and their government. Absent a revolutionary party, absent a socialist program, consciousness remains determined by bourgeois ideology and culture, leading workers to see capitalist society as fixed, as immutable, right? I mean, that's the first challenge to getting to a better world, is to say that a better world is possible and that it can be achieved, that it is not something that we've been defeated, okay. And we see it every day, right? When workers fall prey to the union bureaucrats, protectionist poison, and we see it when they see workers in other countries as their competitors, as their rivals. When a Donald Trump, speaking to the very real sense of loss and vulnerability of blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt, can point to immigrant hordes as the real threat. It takes a conscious leadership to point to the alternative models, to refute the narratives of the misleaders, to bring it back to the ILWU in 1934, as my comrade Howard Keeler, who worked for over 30 years on the Waterfront, was fond of pointing out. In 1934, when the scabs were loading ships in San Francisco Harbor and some other West Coast ports, the longshoremen in Chile, even though they were under a quite repressive government, refused to handle scab cargo. Longshoremen in Australia and some other countries did the same. That kind of international support was one of the factors that helped to win that strike. Of course, it was the massive San Francisco general strike and the threat of extending it to the rest of the West Coast that finally won the establishment of the Longshore Union in 1934. But that international solidarity then, as today, was absolutely critical. So how do we get from point A to point B? Well, it's true you can't pull a class struggle out of your ass, right? And it's true that real revolutionary crisis occurs when the order breaks down to some extent, when people cannot envision going on as they have been because the condition in which they're living has just become too unbearable. That's when, to crib a term from science, a paradigm shift occurs, or as Stephen Jay Gould put it in biological context, you have sort of a punctuated equilibrium. Something that wasn't imaginable yesterday, like revolution, suddenly becomes the only feasible solution. So is it just a matter of, waiting until things get bad enough? When the Stalinists tried that in Germany, right? After Hitler, our turn. And that didn't work out so well. Although I guess they did get a turn after a while in half of Germany, but, only after the German working class had been drowned in blood and broken under the Nazi jackboot. History shows that waiting passively is the road to barbarism. As we look around at the existential threats today, from climate change and the threat that the earth will become uninhabitable, to the nuclear threat posed by the US imperialist hostility to Russia, we need to draw the lesson from the tragedies of the German Revolution. We need to go back to the authentic Leninist model, unperverted by Stalinist degeneration, which was the model that Leon Trotsky, who was one of the co-leaders of the revolution with Lenin, was trying to return the communist movement internationally to the path to. If we do that, we see a model in the concept of the transitional demands and the transitional program to struggle for the leadership of the working class. Trotsky wrote the transitional program in 1938, and there's been a sort of mythology that it was something that he invented at that point to sort of give guidance. And I think that when you go back and you really look at the history, what he was really doing was codifying the sort of strategic orientation that had actually developed out of the Russian Revolution and over the early years of the Communist International. And he was trying to provide it as a new direction, but he was also salvaging something, right? He was salvaging what he thought was what was the best aspects of the programs that had come out of the Bolshevik Revolution and preserving it from degeneration, from corruption. And Trotsky opens the program talking about that strategic task. He says the strategic task today, and I think it's as true as it was in 1938, is that classical social democracy functioning in an epoch of progressive capitalism divided its program into two parts, independent of one another. The minimum program, so like your trade union struggles, your wage fights, which limited itself to reforms within the framework of bourgeois democracy, and the maximum program, which promised substitution of socialism for capitalism in the indefinite future. Between the minimum and the maximum program, no bridge existed. And indeed, social democracy has no need of such a bridge, since the word socialism is used only for holiday speechifying. The Comintern has set out to follow the path of social democracy in an epoch of decaying capitalism, when in general there can be no discussion of systematic social reforms and the raising of masses' living standards, when every serious demand of the proletariat and every serious demand of the petty bourgeois inevitably reaches beyond the limits of capitalist property relations and of the bourgeois state. The strategical task of the Fourth International lies not in reforming capitalism, but in its overthrow. The political aim, the conquest of power by the proletariat for the purposes of expropriating the bourgeoisie. So, Trotsky goes on to emphasize that the goal isn't to reject struggles for reforms, right? That we want to be consistent defenders of the democratic rights, consistent fighters in reform movements, but on the other hand, that the key is to provide that bridge from the day-to-day union struggles to the revolutionary goals of the proletariat. The program included demands like a sliding scale of wages and hours, 30 for 40, to combat unemployment, factory committees as sort of workers' councils in embryo, workers' control and expropriation of industry and banks, the struggle against the discrimination against minorities and against imperialist war. I'm being mindful of time. I could go on a lot more about the history of the labor movement, Trotskyist work on the trade unions, particularly in that Minneapolis strike, and what I see as some of the shortcomings too. I want to take it back to the idea of using this sort of a program within the trade unions. Again, it wasn't a wholesale invention, right? There were the trade union educational leagues here. And in the beginning, in the 1920s, when William Z. Foster was first won over to the Communist Party, a part of what it was a recognition that the dual unionist strategy of the IWW, the Wobblies, had been smashed. It had been smashed by the First World War and by vicious campaigns by the bosses in support of the government. Foster's insight was a strategy of born from within the old craft unions and trying to inject them with a new militant leadership. And when he became won over to communism, the recognition that it would be a revolutionary leadership on a revolutionary program. Foster degenerated, the TUEL degenerated long before the Communist Party became wholly Stalinized at the end of the 1920s. And it also sort of devolved into working in blocks, and then a dual red union strategy where they rejected that strategy for a period of time, and I could go into details on that too. But that early caucus work we look to as something of a model. And the Spartacist League coming out of the Socialist Workers' Party in the early 1960s and going back and looking at that record and looking beyond just the great success of the organizing drives in Minneapolis, which were very important. A friend of mine, Brian Palmer, has just finished his second volume of biography of James P. Cannon. And he'd written a book on the Teamster strikes before, but there's a huge chapter in it on the Teamster strikes. And there are just so many insights into the way in which they organized the unemployed, the critical role that women played in supporting the strike activity, the degree to which as a consciously political movement, they were able to sort of struggle against the casual sexism and emphasize the role that women could play in supporting that. Wasn't always perfect, right? People are a product of their environment, of their time, but was still heads and shoulders above what anybody else was doing at that period of time, and was what led to the fusion with the Mustyites too in Toledo Auto, was the recognition that both groups had about the need to bring the unemployed into the struggle so that the unemployed couldn't be broken off and manipulated and used as scabs, and fighting for the rights of the unemployed too. Anyways, getting sidetracked because I'm condensing, but one of the insights that the Spartacist League had when they went back and looked at this stuff was that in all of these extensive conversations that the American Trotskyists had with Trotsky, that he was constantly pushing them away from just relying on these united fronts with various wings of rank and file movements or out labor bureaucrats or the Stalinists or other formations, and to build caucuses around the transitional program. And what the Spartacus League did in several industries, tried to do with the Communication Workers of America, in auto, and most successfully in the ILWU, was to build caucuses on a highly political basis. Howard Keeler, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, who was very influential in the construction of that caucus, had actually been, as he characterized it, a third-period Stalinist. He'd been a member of the Communist Party throughout the very difficult 1950s. He'd been recruited at the end of World War II when he was in the army, and had been sympathetic to the Chinese Revolution when it occurred, but had remained within the Stalinist Communist Party. And by the 1970s, had been active as a union oppositionist in the ILWU for a number of years, but very dissatisfied with the activity of the Stalinists in the Union, and found a copy of Isaac Deutscher's biography of Trotsky in a used bookstore and started reading it. And, it was sort of like a light went on that, these were a lot of the criticisms that he had that he hadn't looked at previously, that, was sort of a wake-up call to him. And it changed his entire perspective, right? He had been himself in various maneuvers with opposition forces to Harry Bridges and electoral blocks and things like that. And the militant longshore program that they codified and that he built once he came over to Trotskyism was based on, and this is an example from 1987 of the demands. They did change somewhat over time, but it just gives a flavor. Defend our jobs and livelihood. 6-hour shifts, no extensions, at 8 hours pay, manning scales on all ship operations, 1 man, 1 job. Defend the hiring hall. Use regular gangs on container ships. No dispatch of unit gangs. Defend union conditions and safety through job action. Basically, these were anti-chiseling resolutions. Defend our union. No Class B or Class C longshoremen. Register directly to Class A. Keep racist anti-labor government and courts out of the union and BALMA. Support unions' resistance against court suits and government investigations. Union action to break down racial and sexual discrimination and employer favoritism on the waterfront. Organize for a coast-wide strike to get what we need. No concessions, no givebacks. There were calls in it for building labor solidarity. At that time, it was the Patco and Hormel strikes that were really decisive events going on. Stop Nazi Klan terror through union-organized labor Black Latino defense actions. No dependence on capitalist police or courts to smash the fascists. Working class action to stop Reagan's war drive. Labor strikes to oppose U.S. military actions against Cuba, Nicaragua, or Salvadorian leftist insurgents. Boycott military cargo to Central America. Build labor action to smash the apartheid injunction. International labor solidarity. Oppose protectionist trade restrictions for a massive trade union program of aid to help non-U.S. workers build unions and fight superexploitation by the multinational corporations. Defend undocumented workers with union strike action. And, I think I'll just end with a couple of things quotes from Howard, that one of his orientations in doing this trade union work in the ILWU was sort of the understanding that he came to in this period of time, that the only real alternative to the bureaucracy was to pose class struggle oppositional formations, which stand as a political alternative to all varieties of business unionism. The very best of such formations of the rank and file movements will simply degenerate into nickel and dime economism or social democratic maneuverism, absent a program. So I think, again, there's a lot we could talk about, but I want to be mindful and give people time to interact and discuss.